thank you so much, Dion, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I did an episode earlier with Isabel Bomecki, who's kind of a nuclear energy influencer, and you're in a similar vein, doing a lot to, communicate the science around nuclear, and made some pretty interesting moves in your career to, from being focused on the environment overall to really doubling down and focusing on nuclear energy specifically. For those who don't know you, would be great if you could just kind of start by, walking through your background a little bit and telling us your story and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on your podcast, Jake. Well, I have quite a long history of environmental activism on my CV, and it ranges from, undertaking more professional work like publishing a book. I had a book published some years ago called The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting, and it's an evidence-based book. I read hundreds of studies to write it. And the idea is that if you're a family or you want to have a family, which is what I wanted at the time when I started to write it, you can make lifestyle changes that will enable you to keep your carbon footprint low. For a long time, I was very proud of having a low carbon footprint, and I knew that if I had children, that might change. So I wanted to know, what are the best scientifically evidenced ways of keeping our footprint low as a family. I kind of shifted gears on that after a while. I was involved in lots of different green campaign organizations, and when I heard about Extinction Rebellion, I wasn't there at the start when they were founded, but when I heard that we're saying, look, pressure shouldn't be on the individual to change. This is a society-wide problem. This is a global problem. It's a much more macro problem. I thought, actually, I kind of agree with that. I spent a decade talking to people about changing their carbon footprint and reading research on how we can live more sustainably and going into behavioral psychology. And I just realized that actually it's not making enough of a difference. Not to sound too pessimistic about it, and I still live with a fairly low carbon footprint. It's difficult to do. I don't expect everybody to be able to manage it. And actually, even if everybody did do it, it's not saving as much energy as we think, and especially as population goes up, actually our emissions continue to increase. So it really appealed to me that they were saying that, and that they were saying, look, listen to the scientists, look at the IPCC report. So I was invited to become a spokesperson quite quickly after joining Extinction Rebellion. And I felt that it was a really positive thing to begin with, because I was able to talk about climate change and suddenly everybody was listening. Whereas, I'd spent years talking about it and struggling to get a talk, on the agenda in a wild, be invited to like a wildlife organization doing an evening of talks, and I'd say I want to talk about climate, and they'd say, well, can you talk about green parenting instead? It's very hard to talk about climate change. I think people have forgotten this actually, but before Extinction Rebellion, before Fridays for the Future, it was just not a popular topic. It was really hard. I even wrote something for the Huffington Post, which was, the title of it was something like, can we start using the C word? And I was talking about climate change. So I was really excited to be involved in the beginning because of all of that. But I just found that for me, the evidence base wasn't quite there for things that were happening, that the organisation was advocating for. I think that there's a problem. I mean, I had all these criticisms when I was in Extinction Rebellion, very involved in Extinction Rebellion. Things like, they have 3 demands for the government, and the demand is probably their biggest kind of campaign objective, which is that they want citizen assemblies to replace the system we have. So they want a different political system. I've advocated for that. I've read up on citizen assemblies. I'm not saying that I disagree with it, but I just started to think, if you're talking about climate change, you're really just talking about bringing down emissions. These are social changes that we want, and if we confuse them, then we risk allowing one to just run its course, which is climate change, continue to get out of hand. And we shouldn't lump them together. And I kind of wanted to distance myself from that a little bit, actually, because also it gets muddy when you talk about science. If you bring in too much of these other ideologies. There were various reasons like that I ended up stepping away and was asked to advocate for nuclear energy, which I was happy to do because I'd been kind of privately nuclear for a little while and just realized that it wasn't acceptable in the groups that I was in. And I thought, actually, you know what? I might have done some damage in the past by being anti-nuclear and by writing things that were anti-nuclear. Not massively heavily, but definitely played my part and did a lot of kind of advocating for renewables, in the past. And I realized that actually none of that had helped to bring down emissions. And probably if I was able to help get a nuclear reactor built, it would probably be my biggest contribution to humanity in terms of bringing down emissions. And all climate change is about bringing down those emissions. I'm not saying that there aren't other issues involved, because there are, and there's lots of other things you can talk about. But really, all it is about is bringing down those emissions, because if you do that, no more climate change. That's it. And that I find it, it's difficult at the moment because that's almost been forgotten, just been buried. And it's the most simple and true fact about our carbon emissions driving climate change, and that's something that we can change.
Yeah, that's a it's a great story, and appreciate you sharing it. I want to dig in on a lot of different aspects of it and different chapters of your journey thus far, and especially what you're doing now around nuclear. But sometimes it's helpful to dig into some things from the past as well. And I think one, the first thing that comes to mind for me is you decide to write this book kind of at the intersection of the green movement and parenting, which is kind of a unique combination. I'm curious, why, kind of what motivated you to write that in the first place, and why, how did you come to connect like the green movement and parenting? Those are kind of the two things that you want to write about, and you think that there's actually some value in doing so. And I know it sounds like your focus, has come a bit away from, carbon footprint on the individual level and more towards some of these macro things. But just back then, even, why was this interesting to you, and why did you decide to write the book?
Well, first of all, I wanted to have children. And, obviously this is a huge debate in the green movement. And I think it's very sad that people think that they shouldn't have children.
Can I interject there and actually ask, like, why is that a big, I mean, I can kind of guess, but why is that a big debate in that world?
Well, it's the population debate, which actually, if you get too far into it, it can become quite sinister and ugly. And there are people, there are people that I worked with in Extinction Rebellion who are openly Malthusian. Basically, they believe that the population shouldn't go above a certain amount of people. And, if lots of those people get wiped out, then that's good, because we're at what you would call or consider sustainable numbers. Whereas I've read a lot of research that actually says it's more about the way we live and consumerism than about how many of us there are. For example, a lot of people in developing countries who live very simple lifestyles can have huge families and have less of an impact than a single individual living in the West, particularly somewhere like America, and then Britain following close after. So, I just don't buy into that rhetoric anyway. And I think it's a little bit nasty as well, because people can end up kind of finger pointing and saying, well, they're having families. And actually, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a big carbon footprint, because that tends to be tied to, your lifestyle and how much money you have and how much access you have to, do you have access to a car? Do you fly all the time? All of those things really, really stack up. And if you really boil down climate change to what it is about emissions, then it is about your carbon footprint. So I wrote the book because I just personally wanted to keep my carbon footprint low. And I found that as I started looking things up, all I found was pseudoscience. Everything, oh my goodness, every different aspect of where you give birth, to what you eat, just complete, and how you treat your kids, how you treat them with medication. So I actually had a chapter in the book, which was very controversial for some people. It's on vaccines. Now, if you just flick through the book and you see a green parenting book, you're probably going to assume it is anti-vaccine. And of course it wasn't, because I just read the studies and I wrote what they said. There was nothing, it's not even very opinion based. If you have a look at it, there's a lot of facts. It's very fact based. And it was really just writing it for people who were reaching out to me at the time saying, well, what should I do about this? Or what should I do about that? I care about the planet. And I said, they go and read this paper. And let's face it, most parents don't have time and energy to go away and read free scientific papers. And even if they do, they might not actually really understand what's, science literacy that's required to understand what that research is saying might not be there. So I thought I was kind of doing a favor. A chapter on vaccines, I actually received hate mail. Because of it, I also got endorsed by Bill McKibben. It very much split people. I think green parents, or people who are green-minded, who happen to be parents, whatever you want to think about it. And I had a lot of support, and I also had a lot of angry comments. And I remember one woman emailing me and saying, I completely agree with everything in the book. I agree about diet, and I agree about travel, and all of that stuff. That chapter on vaccines, you've got that wrong. Those scientists, they're being paid by Big Pharma. I thought it was really funny, actually. And I wrote back to her and I said, the same scientists that inform data in this chapter is exactly the same as in the vaccines chapter. It's no different. But she kind of, wasn't having any of it. But it was an interesting discussion for me, very eye-opening, where this kind of woo just creeps into different areas in the green movement specifically. And it is everywhere. It's not just in the environmental movement. There is a lot of it in the environmental movement. And it's I find it worrying. And I think actually it's the worst thing if you're trying to do something like tackle climate change, because you need evidence-based solutions that have been proven to work. You don't want to go with gut feelings about what the right thing is to do, because that's not going to cure. If you're sick and you go with your gut feeling that you go to a homeopath or whatever it is that your mum told you that if you drink a ginger tea you're not going to be sick anymore when you drink the tea, you're not going to get in the medication that you need. That's actually a dangerous thing, and there's lots of examples where that has actually been a dangerous thing and had serious repercussions for people and their health, and even for children in the way that they're raised. So it's really important to me to get the facts out there, although in hindsight I would write that book differently. So after that book, because of that chapter, I went back to university and I did a master's in science communication, because I wanted to understand more about, how do you communicate with groups who, disagree fundamentally on these issues? How do you talk to them? And, the first thing they kind of said was, look, most people aren't highly science literate. They don't respond to facts. Don't just put lots of facts in a book, which is exactly what I'd done. So I would do that very differently now, and I do it much more as a storytelling. And my writing now does tend to be more of a storytelling process than just conveying factual information to people.
So understanding that you might have, again, you might have come to view some of the macro factors as more important than what people can do at the individual level, but you said you're still, practicing a lot of these low carbon footprint activities, just whether it's from your book or some of the things that you just do now. Would be curious to hear like some of the most important things that if someone's listening and they want to do like one thing, and understanding that it's not going to like solve the climate crisis, but it's actually like a pretty good thing that's pretty easy to do. What would that thing, or what might a couple of those options be?
Sure. So actually, one of the reasons I kind of stopped advocating so much for it is because what's easy for one person isn't for another. And I felt, uncomfortable advocating for things that people find difficult. There are some things that have become super easy. So cutting out the amount of meat and dairy in your diet, or sourcing it from, good farmers, local farmers, so that it hasn't, traveled, doesn't have all those food miles attached to it, hasn't traveled a long way. And maybe it's that those hens are free range and they're well looked after. Things like that are really important. I mean, I've been vegan for a long time, but when I went vegan in 2002, it was actually very hard, and I would not have suggested to most people that they should do it. And now it's super easy. I just read recently the January, as they call January, kind of campaign to expose people to veganism. It's had a record numbers of people signing up to it, because it's just so easy now. You go into a supermarket and there's 10 different kinds of vegan cheese. I mean, I remember the first vegan cheese that I ever bought. It was the first kind that came out. I can't remember the brand now. They're not around anymore. And I put it under, I was so excited to have cheese again that I put it under the grill to melt it, and the actual cheese caught on fire. Well, now you can melt all of the different vegan cheeses, and some of them really do taste very convincing. That's from someone who hasn't eaten stuff for 20 years, 15 years. I've tried stuff and thought, wow, this is actually so easy to just make that switch for your health, for the environment. I'd still say, it's not, like you said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix climate change. It's not even always the best ethical option, because if you're getting something from your farmer that's locally made and it's supporting them and it's looking after the land, that can actually be a really good option. And I know a lot of vegans don't like hearing me say that, but looking at research, that's what I found. So you have to kind of weigh up a little bit, is what I'm trying to say. So there's lots of things you can do, and that's why there's a whole chapter on this in my book, which does not say go vegan, but it says making these small changes does actually lower your carbon footprint. Obviously, as I say, I've come to kind of say, well, it's not enough on a larger scale, on a global scale. But if you want to do things personally, reduce your intake, look for more ethical sources, research. I get a veg box from a local farmer who grows on a local farm, supports his business. He looks after the land really well. So he does lots of tree planting, uses permaculture techniques, lots of good stuff going on there. I've been to visit, help out actually, just because I was kind of interested in learning more about the farming techniques. And we get all our vegetables from there, which was great, by the way, during the pandemic, because when the supermarkets were running out of stuff, I had it all there in my veg box every week. Always had potatoes and carrots and everything that we get every week. Sprouts. Sounding like a real hippie now. So that's one of the bigger things. Another thing that I've done is that I never learned to drive. It has been difficult though. So again, is that easy for you? Well, you don't know until you try, is what I often say to people. There's definitely been occasional time where I've thought, oh, that would be so much easier if I could drive. But we've managed completely fine without having to. We use public transport. When we go on holiday, we go on the train. It's not, again, it's sometimes it can be more expensive. So I'm aware that people might want to take flights because they're cheap. Flying is also really high carbon activity. So consider even just, reducing the number of flights you take, or if you're traveling more locally, like within the country, just replacing that with train travel. There's lots of different little things. Those are probably the top ones that I would suggest.
Yeah, it's interesting. What do you think about like carbon offsets and that whole industry where people are maybe caring less about like lowering their footprint and pointing their efforts more towards just like being able to pay to offset the damage that they themselves may be somewhat responsible for by funding some carbon offsets from one source or another?
I haven't flown for a very long time. I remember when offsets were first announced, and they were a bit of a scam, and we were calling them greenwashing, because it would be things like, oh, we'll plant this many trees for your flight. Those trees might not make it to adulthood, or they might be chopped down once they do make it to adulthood. Obviously once you chop the tree down, the carbon is back out in the atmosphere. So I remember, and I remember writing in the book that I was against offsets, but since then I know that there are much better schemes, and it completely depends on what the company's doing and whether or not they're actually legitimately doing it, and that there's a lot of good research out there on that, lots of good articles of people. And it's not something I've looked into just because I don't fly, and I've not had to research it for a new book. Definitely it's worth looking into and considering. But if you have to fly, of course offset anyway. Even if you're offsetting by just paying that cost to a company that's going to go and plant trees, or you plant the trees yourself. It just makes sense. I mean, we should all be planting trees all the time. It's just a really super easy thing that we should be doing, that we're sadly not doing, because there's just so many positives. It's good for air quality, good for dealing with issues with flooding and drought. It's good for regulating local temperatures, local areas. If you have a little urban forest, as they call them, it's good for wildlife. There are so many pluses that I sort of can't believe that we talk about being a climate emergency and we don't plant more trees. So yeah, there's lots of good things that you can look into. I don't know the exacts, and I can't recommend a specific example with offsetting that I think is good. I just know that a lot of people have looked into it and said, look, there's definitely schemes on the horizon now for those people that do need to fly.
Yeah, I don't know if they're any good, and I'm not like I haven't done enough work to say so, but I do offsets through a company called Wren, which is WREN. If anyone's interested in checking it out, this isn't like an advertisement or anything like that, but and they don't even know I'm talking about it. But I have like a pretty low carbon footprint, not even out of that much effort, just like kind of the way I live. And so, it's like $5 or $7 a month or something like that to offset it. So I've been doing that for like less than a year at this point, but could be interesting for people. And again, not, I can't say for sure that it's like the perfect thing, but anyway, Zion, I would love to hear, going back and, remembering before you were even interested in climate or really aware of some of the issues of our generation, and, this current time in the world where this is and it has been an issue for decades now and just kind of keeps growing and growing in terms of people who are paying attention and resources that are going towards it and everything like that. Would love to hear if you can remember back, like how you kind of became interested in this in the first place in terms of like environmentalism and trying to do your part to fight the climate crisis, and just like how you decided to make this general field kind of your life's work.
I have always been concerned about climate change. My earliest memories from when I was a little kid are about learning about global warming and being really worried about it. And actually, when I think about it now, I was anxious. I had eco anxiety before we had a term for it. My parents didn't know what was wrong with me. When there was a storm, I used to worry that we were all going to drown because it would be flooding, because I thought it was like I didn't think the flood would cause it. I just understood that that's what global warming meant. And that's what we called it back then. That's what we learned in school. It was global warming. So I was concerned from a really young age and was trying to do things from a very young age. Went vegetarian as soon as my parents would allow it. Vegan as soon as I left for university. I was getting my parents to recycle. It was a big annoyance in our household because you didn't have curbside recycling then. You couldn't just put it outside and have it collected. You had to collect it all up, store it somewhere, and then take it to a bottom bank, which was at our supermarket where we did our shopping anyway. So I insisted on storing all this stuff up. And there weren't like bins to put in it. I just had them piled up in the corner. I think I just annoyed my parents, but they sort of just gave in and let me do it after a while. I was very worried and very concerned for a long time. And then went to university and did the first green organization, co-founded this green organization at Reading campus. And we, advocated for renewables. We've got the university to switch to renewable energy. We did lots of campaigns that involved lots of different groups over the years. So there was never really a point where I wasn't involved. And when I did kind of dip out of activism, it was to write my book. And then I kind of came back with Extinction Rebellion. And now I still consider myself to be a climate activist. I just have taken maybe a slightly different route to a lot of other people because I have been on quite a long journey with it.
Great. So, I guess I assumed that you came to care about climate over time, but it sounds like you were more or less born with the, you talk about like being anxious as a kid about it. It sounds like it was just, wired into who you were from the beginning. So it's cool to see that you've been able to kind of build your resume and the, and all of these different capacities of impacting it and continue to do so. Now with more of a nuclear focus. Can we also talk about like you said you mastered in you got a master's in science communication? Like that's not something that I'm super familiar with. What, I know your motivation for doing it was kind of from the book and all of the critical feedback that you got, as well as obviously a lot of positive feedback, but some people were a little critical and you might have been wondering like, why isn't this really working? I have all the facts here. What did you kind of like, what was the main takeaways from that have helped you, post masters be able to really synthesize a lot of the kind of factual information that you're getting from the science and figure out how to more effectively convey it for common people who are listening and may not be like super familiar with the science?
I come from a very working class background. My parents were migrants to this country, to the UK, and they worked in factories. And we had a big family. I didn't know any scientists. Science didn't particularly interest me. That came later. But then when I wrote my book and I researched other similar books that were out there and what were other people writing about climate and about carbon emissions and about green lifestyles, I wrote the book in the vein of what I saw was out there, which is, you know, normal thing to do. And then I went on this master's course, and the lecturer came in one of the classes and said, look, the first thing you need to understand is if you're in this room, you're unusual. You already have a high level of education. You already have a high level of science literacy. You know, you're probably from a science background, you know, and I had actually done some science writing previously. So it's true. I was in, it really opened my eyes to thinking, you know what, I know this because it was more like when I was growing up. You know, not everybody grew up from that and came into this world. This is still quite a niche world. And we still, you know, we have a world that's completely run by dependent on science and technology, really more and more complicated science and technology that hardly anyone understands. And you know, if you're already in that kind of bubble, then you need to understand that you've got to step out of that bubble if you want to communicate. That was sort of the number one thing. And then, you know, we'd be given different tasks and things to do. For example, create a board game that explains a simple concept, and there was, you know, a range of concepts to choose between. And that board game has to be easy and accessible enough for someone without a science background to play it, but to take something away from it about the thing that you're trying to teach. Equally, it needs to be done, you know, it needs to not require a huge attention span. So the challenge was actually that it needed to be something that people could do on their way in or out of a supermarket. So maybe, you know, you have to count the fact that there might be children involved, or there might be children they're trying to occupy while they're playing the game, and then we had to actually go out and do these things. And it was so difficult, and it made you really think about everything. It made you think about everything, about where you were, not just the way you're communicating, but what you were expecting your audience. And another thing they say in science communications, there's no public. You can't talk about general public. There is no public. There are only publics, and very specific publics. And I had heard this before, actually. I think they use it in marketing as well. But in science, it's actually quite a surprising idea, because often it's not there in the communication. The communication is, you know, for a long time hasn't really been there. It's just been scientists just say their thing, and then, you know, the journalist goes and does a write-up, or sees a press release and does a write-up based on that. But the journalist doesn't have any science leaning, doesn't have any science background. They might get something wrong. I mean, that happens all the time, actually, all the time. Not through anyone's fault. As we've seen with things like communications over this pandemic, you know, people need to understand, and they do need to understand why certain things are important. They need to understand why it's important to wear a mask, and they need it communicated really clearly to them, which over here at least hasn't always happened. Really shows the need for it. But it's not a new need, you know, it goes all the way back to, I mean, here we had the mad cow disease BSE crisis, and I remember I was a kid then, and it was very poorly handled actually at the time. And after that, the government would start looking into kind of creating a science communication department, or someone that, you know, actually make sure that they brought some science literacy to the table when things were communicated, because it was done so poorly. And their intention of sort of keeping farmers on side and not alarming the public just didn't work at all. And journalists had a real heyday with the stories of all the different things could happen if you ate beef, or if you'd eaten beef in the last however many years it was, and how it would cause this to happen in your brain. I mean, it was really terrible. When I think about it now, they made a big mistake, a series of big mistakes. Sadly, looking ahead, you know, years later, decades later now, same thing has happened with coronavirus. Poor communication, missteps between science and then the public face of what, you know, the advice is, and even at times what the advice is. And granted, some of that is because the science has had to catch up. You know, in the beginning, we didn't know how it was spread. We thought it was spread more through contact, and then lots of research was done, and they found, okay, it can be spread through surfaces, but that's not actually the main thing. It's actually mainly through droplets in the air. So that's why masks are really efficient, really effective, really important to get those masks on. You know, it took a while for policy to catch up with that. It took a while for people to actually start doing it. It's still not mandatory in most places, although some places are now making it mandatory, like some supermarkets are deciding to. But the actual advice isn't, you know, it can't be enforced in law, basically, by law, if someone's not wearing it in a supermarket, a mask. And yet we know it's the main transmitter of this virus. And so, we looked at case studies like BSE really closely in my master's, and worked out where the communication failures were, and then had to kind of work out what would be the best way of doing it. What would have been and also we look at things like here's 10 different news articles on this topic. So let's skip ahead from BSE. GMOs, that was another thing that happened. GMOs, stem cell research. You get the headlines, don't you? You get designer babies in the headline. Really good communication, really eye-catching. Everybody remembers that. Fills everybody with a sense of fear and dread. Actually, if you look at the research, we'd have to look at the research papers, and they'd say, right, read the articles and now go back and read the research. And you look at the research and you'd see that actually the story there is that some scientist had known someone who had a disease that they passed on to their child that they never want, and they never wanted that to happen again. And so they'd created this amazing technique in editing for preventing people from passing that disease on. I mean, this is phenomenal, right? It's amazing, just like vaccines are amazing. All of these things have the potential to be amazing. Often people work on them because that's what they want to achieve. And then you just get the headline designer babies. That's really sad for the scientist who's doing that work. And it's sad for, people are creating vaccines. We have a vaccine within a year. That's incredible that we have a vaccine within a year for a virus that we never experienced before, that we didn't know existed. I mean, imagine if we'd had to wait 10 years for a vaccine, right? We only had to wait a year, and all of these different scientists around the world have worked on different options as well, so we can actually look at what's going to happen, how effective the vaccine is, and people have worked together, and it's all incredible. But then you look at the polls, so the recent polls here on potential vaccine uptake, is still most people saying they wouldn't have it. They wouldn't have the vaccine. And so then you go, wow, it's all great that science is happening and it's trying to make things better for humanity, trying to save lives. If the understanding isn't there that that's what that vaccine is for, because there's a fear has come in because of miscommunications in the past about vaccines, even though that's to do with past vaccines as well. It's not this vaccine, this is a new vaccine. That's actually really dangerous. That's dangerous for humanity. And that's, that's why I went, I kind of went into science communication anyway, but it became more and more clear from the more that I studied, and also just a lot of the challenges of how difficult it is to actually reach people about specific issues. And some people have done extremely well over the years, like, so David Attenborough, Brian Cox. But when you think about it, there aren't actually a huge number of names that come to mind. And there are a lot of areas of science that aren't represented in that way, which is a real shame, because there's amazing things happening that just, real good antidote to all the doom and gloom that you generally get from, social media or watching the news.
So just because you've brought up the vaccine now, and you brought up vaccines from your book earlier, this is a question that you can pass on and we can just kind of move on. But if you're comfortable talking about it, and I know it's obviously not your field, for people who are concerned about the vaccine for COVID, what might you say to those people? And again, if you just kind of don't feel super comfortable with your knowledge in that specific thing, we can just kind of move on to the next.
Well, my honest response is, learn more about how awful COVID is. There are people, we had 1,300 deaths the other day in one day from COVID. So first of all, it's terrible. It's killing people. We know that. It's hard to know it. It's just a number. If you read up some of these stories, I mean, some of the stories are awful. People dying in care homes, with no one by their side because it's so infectious. The family couldn't come and see them. People dying in hospitals and just, wheeled out so that they could make space for the next person because it's so infectious. It can overwhelm hospitals. That did happen in Italy. They saw it happen. We've been very lucky that it hasn't happened here. But with this new strain that's now developed here, it could happen. And these are really scary things. I think if someone's more scared of the idea of a vaccine, then they don't really understand what coronavirus is and how scary it is, and that we've not had to deal with this before. We haven't dealt with it very well, frankly. I mean, some countries have done better certainly than others, but we've not done very, very well with it in Britain. And numbers remain high. We're still in lockdown. We seem to be in a perpetual lockdown. I'm not against lockdowns. It's not, we're in and out of perpetual lockdowns because we've been slow to bring in mask wearing, because we've not followed important advice previously from, you know, individuals like the SAGE organization, who said, you know, we need to take a break early on, we needed to close schools early on, we needed to not reopen pubs, all of the things that we did wrong, you know. Anyway, you look up the numbers of deaths. I mean, that should be enough for anyone to think, well, I don't want to go through that. But even people who think that they'll just weather it, you know, because they're younger and healthier, although it has been sadly killing people that are younger and healthier, which again, we didn't know at the beginning, when it seemed more like flu that kind of, you know, does tend to elderly people, you know. We realized that actually, even if you recover from it, there's a thing called long COVID. Actually, a friend of mine has this, and she's now in a trial group for long COVID because she was completely 100% healthy, 3 children, single parent, smashing life. You know, she had a job, everything going for her. And then she got COVID in the lockdown in March, and she had a month of struggling to get out of bed. No one could help her either, because you couldn't go and help her because she had an infectious disease, and the kids all had it. One of them developed breathing problems and had to be sent an emergency inhaler. Again, a contact-free drop-off. You know, it's terrible. Really suffered with it. Then kids all get better, but she still has it, and so they've classified it as long COVID. She has the most bizarre ongoing symptoms. It's kind of like almost like, you know, something like chronic fatigue, where they don't quite understand why, but it really can be debilitating if you have to live with that forever, and they don't know if it will last forever, and there's no medication for it, and it just sucks big time. And I'd urge anybody to look up long COVID and decide whether they would rather risk having that. You know, I mean, you're risking death, really, aren't you, with the virus? I mean, you know, not to upset everybody, but let's be honest, that's what it is. That's why it's terrible, and that's why we're all stuck at home, because we don't want to get it and we don't want to spread it. And the best way to eradicate it and not end up with new strains developing, which happens when the virus gets to hang around for a long time. So what happens is it hung around, and they think it was a cancer patient. It was somebody whose body couldn't fight it off immediately, and so it got to mutate because it was hanging around for a long time, and then it was passed on to other people, and now we have a new strain. And we're lucky that the vaccine still works on that strain, but imagine if we had a vaccine resistant strain. You know, these are really not good things. We need to get rid of it as soon as possible. We're really lucky that they worked really hard to create the vaccine. And actually, it's not that I had someone say to me, oh, I'm a bit worried that they did it so quickly, doesn't it normally take 10 years? Actually, no, it can be done quickly. It's things like licenses to get it out to the public that normally takes a long time, and they've managed to bypass those technical, you know, red tape aspects, because they've realized that we need it so desperately, that the situation of not having it is far more dangerous than any potential adverse reactions from the vaccine. And the only adverse reactions that I've seen have been minor, really minor numbers of allergic reaction that happen with any medication. And I say that as someone who's allergic to ibuprofen, by the way. I can't take ibuprofen. You know, that doesn't mean that I would say to other people, don't go near ibuprofen. It's an allergic reaction. That's just my body that doesn't cope with it. You know, if that's not enough of a case, then I don't think anything is really. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know all about how the vaccine was made and the whole process. It's not my area, and that's not, you know, there's plenty of people doing that out there already. If you want to go and see what the scientists are saying and how, you know, read about RNA and all of the technical aspects of it. But really, it comes down to whether you want an ongoing, life-threatening, you know, awful virus is completely just stop the world, or you want the solution to that. And you know, let's remember that's, you know, it came from animals, it came from bats. You know, how is that any better than something that came from a lab? Came from a lab, we can test it, we can understand everything that there is to understand about it. Something that came from a bat, I don't want to be infected with something that came from a wild animal. I want to be infected with something that came from a rat or a bat. I mean, you know, this really just need to think about these issues a little bit more. That is a long answer, and I know it's a little bit dark. That is the reality of the situation we're in. I'm really worried actually that we've got this amazing thing, and then uptake isn't enough. The vaccine uptake isn't enough. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't work. It has to be, you know, for most vaccines, it's usually, I think, between 80 and 90%. I'm not sure what it exactly is for this one. You know, you do need that many people to have it for it to actually work. Otherwise, it's not effective.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your perspective on it. I want to change gears a little bit now and go to your time at Extinction Rebellion before finishing up by talking about nuclear energy a bit and what you're doing today. But on Extinction Rebellion, obviously one of the foremost leading organizations related to climate change and the climate crisis. Um, I understand like you were kind of onboarded to be a spokesperson there, spent some time there, worked on a bit of like a newspaper publication. What were some of the main things that you think you were doing of value there, despite having kind of parted ways now? And then I think it's really interesting, like the way you describe, your motivations and reasons for leaving. You talk about how you basically, you changed your mind, and people, I think changing your mind gets a bit of a bad rap. People view it as like a weakness, but I view it as a strength. It's the ability to kind of see the facts for what they are. And, things, we find out new things over time, all the time. And different sets of information you might be exposed to might, warrant changing, might warrant for like a reasonable person changing their mind, whereas like an unreasonable person would just kind of stick to their guns and whatever they thought in the first place. So I definitely give you credit for that, but would love to hear kind of like what that journey was like through it, and then moving on.
Originally, when I joined Extinction Rebellion, I felt it was really useful that I was able to speak about climate change, to do it. I was often given platforms to do it. I was on the BBC, I went on the Andrew Neil show. Actually, I mean, the turning point came because of the Andrew Neil show, because he asked me about claims that the organisation had made that I didn't feel that I could defend. And I didn't come off looking too good, because it looked like, wow, she doesn't know anything and she can't defend them. But it was more that I didn't want to defend claims that I knew weren't evidence-based. And it very specifically came down to this, something that one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion had said about millions of people dying within a century, or by the end of the century, because of climate change. And I didn't want to defend it. And, bear in mind, it wasn't any kind of official view of Extinction Rebellion. Anyway, it put me in a really awkward position, because I thought, how useful is it to be talking about climate change if you're not really talking about the facts, which is, I want to talk about the actual solutions of ways to fix the problem. And actually, I kind of can't do that in this role anymore, because, just I think they evolved over time into more, I don't know what you would call it, just kind of an organization that's just very worried about the future. Their only solution is completely tied up with complete political overhaul and change. And as I say, for me, that just made it very difficult to just talk about science, and it just kind of muddied the arguments a lot. And I see a lot of people do that now. They make the same arguments and say, look, the system's, Greta Thunberg does it. She says the system's broken. This is a system that brought us climate change, therefore it has to change. I think it's really harsh. I think I'm not defending capitalism or anything like that, although Extinction Rebellion never had an actual opinion on capitalism officially. There were diverse groups within, diverse opinions on it within the group. But, this system has also given us some good things. And I think this is a really controversial thing to say, but it's true of fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels, terrible. And the industry has done terrible things. So fossil fuels, terrible for because it's driven global warming, because it's caused climate change. And the industry has done terrible things where they've misled people, they've lied, they've funded climate denial, they've lied about the impact of their product. All of those things are true. At the same time, fossil fuels enable to lift us out of poverty, to have high quality of life, to have things that they don't have in developing countries. And I say that with family in a developing country in India. My parents migrated from, where I've been to visit a long time ago when I used to fly. And they, come on, still burning wood for fuel. Half the day is taken up with that. Half the day is taken up with subsistence farming. And if it doesn't rain, the crops don't grow. And all right, we parents send a bit of money over to help them out, but they do not have a high quality of life. They don't have access to medicine. They don't have access to hospitals. I was aware the whole time that I was in this little remote village and a lot of India is made up of these remote villages. Actually, I was miles and miles. I was maybe a 3 hour drive away from the nearest airport and hospital. If I got bitten by a snake or a wild dog, which they have out there, chances of survival not great. Actually, no one there has medication. No one has the skills, and if anyone's lucky enough to get any kind of education, they leave that remote dwelling. They don't want to live there. So I think we have to sort of zoom out a little bit and go, okay, these things are bad. Humanity has done amazing things too. And if you go to something like gapminder.org, I don't know if you know about Gapminder, but take the quiz on there about improvements, about what. So the quiz is to test your knowledge of how humanity's progressed over time, and you will be surprised at the improvements. And even I have never been able to get 100% on that quiz, and I take it every now and again once I've updated it just to see where I fit. And we are doing so many incredible things all of the time. That's the kind of takeaway, and that's not it's not opinions. It's based on very solid statistics. It's actually founded by a statistician called Hans Rosling, who did a really good talk on how a lot of things are getting better in the world. So anyway, Extinction Rebellion just became very kind of missed, very negative space for me, and I felt that actually that was not the message that I wanted to put out into the world. I have children. I don't want them to have eco-anxiety. I've lived with that. I lived with it for a long time, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And yet I would see a lot of the young people who are involved with that group, not because of Extinction Rebellion, but just because that's kind of how the conversation has gone about climate change, become very doomist and very gloomy. Just the levels of anxiety, I just thought, and depression, I thought it's just not, young people saying we never have families, we have no futures. I mean, Greta says it, she says she has no future. And I just thought I've got to distance from this. So I completely it was not very well received either, because I did make some public criticisms, although I'd maintain that the criticisms that I made within Extinction Rebellion were far more of them. And I founded the newspaper because I wanted to reach outside of the echo chamber a little bit. And a lot of people still read newspapers, they still trust newspapers, and we felt that newspapers in general weren't doing a very good job in talking about climate and educating people about what's happening. So it was one of the most significant things that I did in Extinction Rebellion was found the newspaper, put a team together, and then we had a team of volunteer distributors around the country. We'd have 150,000 copies, I think it was, a month, made of this paper that I completely designed with the design team from scratch. That was all our own articles, and it was free, and it was distributed all around the UK to people, just sort of a conversation going about climate change that we didn't feel was already happening in the media, although I think that shifted a lot now, and it's a lot more normal to see things being talked about. Certainly in the beginning that wasn't true, and I think that was probably quite a valuable thing to do, because we certainly had a lot of emails and letters written back to us from people who would say, never heard of you, or never know about climate change, what can I do? Which, it's very gratifying if you kind of exist in a little echo chamber and you want to break out of it. It was a good brought out for a short while I was the editor of the newspaper.
So now you're co-founder of a company, Nuclear for Net Zero. You guys have a great website that I looked through and was able to learn a lot from. Kind of designed, I think, for the common person without too much. You don't really need anything going in. You just can kind of just read in plain English why nuclear is is an important alternative to be thinking about, and to be the reason why the pro-nuclear people feel the way that they do. Would love to kind of last thing we talk about today would just to be kind of to zoom in on nuclear and talk about what is nuclear energy, why is it so important, and you've decided to invest the majority of your time and energy into nuclear. I'm sure, like we talked about, that wasn't an obvious thing for you some time ago, and it kind of rose to the surface as the area where you wanted to apply yourself. Would love to just kind of get an overview a little bit, and then maybe we can debunk some of the myths as well, and why it gets such negative coverage from a lot of different folks.
Nuclear for Net Zero, it's not a company, it's just a group of activists, climate activists, small group of us that kind of just came up with this idea. I co-founded it, and it has some really amazing members. It's actually a really nice community that it's grown into. We wanted to do more actions. We've done a few now, but obviously because of the situation with the lockdown and things, we haven't been able to for a little while. So someone very kindly in the group offered to make a website and create some online presence. So he's gone and done that, and he's done a brilliant job. We don't receive any funding or anything. We're not any kind of, we're not an official company or anything like that. We're just a group of, I mean, we're all listed on there, I think, or most of us are, very different backgrounds, all of us, but all just care about the same issue, which is, nuclear. And we all understand that nuclear saves lives, and nuclear can help stop climate change. And it's about time that we had a bit of that kind of activism, actually, solutions-based positive activism in the environmental movement.
So then can we actually do, like, for people who don't know too much about nuclear energy, I talked about a bit with Isabel, but can we talk about some of kind of the fundamentals of what makes it interesting, such as that it's like, a low carbon version of electricity, it's reliable, 24/7, unlike a lot of different energies. It's very dense in terms of like how much space you need, just kind of like some of the main advantages, and then some of the main myths as well as people, concerns that people have that aren't necessarily or really aren't at all evidence-based.
Nuclear energy is a very clean source of energy. It's kind of sad that it doesn't get lumped in with renewables, actually. In fact, I often see people lump it in with fossil fuels, which is completely wrong. It's not only clean in that it's very low carbon. The actual sites are very compact, so they're very friendly towards things like rewilding and nature, because they don't take up a lot of space. The biggest criticism that I hear about nuclear nowadays tends to be cost. People say that it's costly, and time. It takes a lot of time, which I would say, if we're in a climate emergency and no cost is too great, then I don't think it is too costly to invest in something that can give us 60 or 80 or more years of clean energy. And it's one kind of cost in terms of, all right, yeah, any kind of energy source, any source at all, whether you're talking about solar panels or wind turbines or nuclear or anything, will require, some impact on the environment. That's just unavoidable. I would still say that you'd want to then choose option that has the lowest impact on the environment. It takes the least space, and then it has the highest return in terms of, how long is it going to last? These are just really simple facts that, well, I was going to say anyone can look them up, but there's a lot of misinformation about nuclear out there, actually. In terms of time as well, there's an interesting thing that people don't realize, which is about the standardization model, which it has been shown basically in countries where they build a reactor and then they build another identical reactor and another one at the same site, and they build another site. So say we built Hinkley, we go ahead, all right, Hinkley's taking a long time, it's maybe taking a little bit longer than it should have. This often happens with all construction projects. Now kind of ironed out all the bits that slowed it down, and they know exactly what to do next time to make it faster. Same team, they just need to get the same team making exactly the same design in a different location, which would be Sizewell C, which is why I've been advocating for that. And then that will shave years off the amount of time that it takes to build. Anything that we build will take time. There is no kind of magic overnight we're going to have a clean energy source that provides everything. And I've even heard people say, oh, well, that might be just around the corner. But honestly, I heard that 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, I used to say it myself because I believed it. It hasn't happened. And actually, when I used to be anti-nuclear, when I learned that nuclear was actually the closest we have to this thing, it's a very dense, compact, long-lasting, reliable source of clean energy. I just sort of went, oh my goodness, the solution was there this whole time. And it is an important solution. I've had some people say, well, why nuclear? Why don't you go for other things, rewilding or agriculture? And actually, like I said, as a long-term vegan, I have advocated for a lot of, for things like that. I have advocated, and I have protested against fossil fuels, and I've done all kinds of things. as an environmentalist for a long time. But if you look at the really basic facts, over 70% of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from our energy use. Energy is the biggest slice of the pie. We have to change it to get emissions down. Now, as we've discussed, behavioral change isn't going to cut it. People making lifestyle changes isn't actually going to make a significant difference. The only way it would is if it was like energy was rationed. And I've even heard people advocate for this, and I don't like it. I'm not comfortable with the idea of ecofascism. I don't think that people should be told that they can only use a certain amount. And I think that it would, as with everything, become a thing where, you know, the poor people for the most and the rich people, you know, find ways to buy more energy or whatever. Also, kind of authoritarian, it's just not a good way, you know, it's not a good way forward. I mean, how much energy are we talking about? The scenarios that I've seen in order to, you know, there's a report that I saw made here in Britain, which shows a pathway to net zero through 100% renewables. And it requires something like 60% of energy reduction. I mean, can you reduce your energy usage by 60%? That's a huge reduction. And it doesn't factor in, when I looked at the report, it was when I was more kind of, you know, thinking that, yeah, we'll just have renewables power everything. It's a real myth, actually. Lots of people believe that. And then I looked at this report and I went, well, that's using the best numbers, the best data, the best battery storage. It's just not enough, is it? And I thought, well, if it's not reliable, if it's not, you know, it might be fine in a really sunny country, but what happens when it's not a sunny day or it's not a windy day here? You know, recently when it wasn't so windy here, our wind dropped down from 20%, which is a good amount. 20% of energy from wind is good, but it dropped down from 20% before, and we had to fill the gap with coal. To import coal. You know, that's not good because we're trying to get off of fossil fuels. That should be the aim. It shouldn't be I love nuclear or I love renewables. It should just be how do we get off fossil fuels? They're driving climate change, and they're also really bad for air pollution, which kills millions of people a year. So yeah, I basically, you know, the more research I read, the more I came to realize that I'd been on the wrong side with this. And I, you know, listened to people like, you know, climate scientists and real experts like James Hansen, you know, lots of people that have done really good research. Like David Mackay wrote an entire book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It's free to read online, actually. And you can just look at the fact that it's not even about opinion, it's about data and it's about numbers. And in terms of meeting our needs and not forcing everyone to live with exponentially less, and also factoring things like this report didn't factor in things like the intermittent energy. Some people said, well, we can live with that. What's wrong with that? Well, they don't understand what that means. Do we want to live through blackouts? Do we want to have a situation where hospitals, you know, equipment in hospitals goes off? Because that's what happens in a blackout. We're very lucky that we've never had to live through that. So it's hard to imagine, but that's what intermittent energy means. And we actually saw some of that happen because of the fires and other things happening in California late last year, and they were having blackouts. It's terrible. And for example, this new vaccine, it has to be kept at a certain temperature. So if that was being kept in a hospital in a fridge, you know, you might have 1,000 doses there. Electricity goes out. That's it. You've just lost all of that. All the patients that are dependent on equipment. That's it. You know, and you know, it sounds dark and horrible to say it, but actually I think people don't realize when they're talking about intermittency being okay, that's what they say. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people who have then gone, okay, yeah, I didn't think about that. And I think maybe, you know, I'm a bit more aware of it because I have been to visit my family in India and they don't have electricity. And you really realize, you know, it's not like, oh, I've been camping for a couple of days in the UK and it's a really nice experience and it was nice to switch off my phone. It's not like that. It's like more like my daughter's sick and I can't get medication. Even that they don't have money, my parents send them money to help. They don't have access because they don't have infrastructure. They don't have roads. They don't have schools in the villages. You know, they don't have the high quality of life that burning all of these fossil fuels brought us. And yeah, all right, that was bad. We did a bad thing. So now we need to get to net zero. I would argue as soon as possible. You know, I would make a moral argument to say we should do it as soon as possible. Because we've used up our carbon budget and other countries need to burn a little bit, you know, to lift themselves out of poverty, and also because they are going to be the hardest hit. Global South is going to be the hardest hit with climate change. They don't have any of the protections we have. They don't have the infrastructure. We need to help in everywhere we can, really, I think. But that is getting more into the kind of political side of it. Just in just the facts add up for themselves. Waste has been shown to be some of the most well-managed waste of all energy production. So, for example, solar panels, people have this idea of like, an interesting idea people have when you talk about renewables, things like solar and wind, where they think, oh, well, it's natural, so it's because it's using wind or whatever, but it's still a technology. There's still technology, and it still requires mining, and it still requires construction, and those turbines have to be made somewhere, often in China, and then brought here and then assembled here. It's still big construction projects, and there's actually a big problem with end of their life cycle, which is that we don't know how to get rid of them, so they're not recycled at the moment. And the solar panels in particular is not good because they actually contain a lot of toxic chemicals that just end up in landfill sites, basically, because we don't know how to deal with it. When people talk about waste, I always think it's just such an old myth that still is kicking around in some people's heads, and then they're loud about it and everybody believes it. But actually, if you read up on some website actually is ourworldindata.org, I think it is, really good breakdown of these are the safest sources of energy. Nuclear's up there at the top. This is how many deaths has arisen from different sources, and that's including all of the disasters in the nuclear scenario. Absolutely nothing compared with fossil fuels. It's just not, if the numbers aren't even there. If we were going to be afraid of something, and it should actually be fossil fuels. I've even seen data that shows how radioactive coal plants are, and it's more than any nuclear plant in operation. It's mad. It's the more I read up on it, the more I went, wow, I really had some some of the wrong information fed to me through just people believing pseudoscience, really myths, and spreading them around. And now I've kind of made it my mission to undo some of that, because I think actually this is really hopeful for people who are feeling like there's no future and there's no way to help the planet. Because there is something that we can do. It's not the only thing. Absolutely, we need the rewilding. We need to change the way we eat. There's lots of things that need to happen. Like, as I say, the biggest slice of the pie is energy use. And actually, all that ever happens, no matter how many people change their diets and drive less and fly less, emissions continue to go up. They continue to increase because there are more people, and because we use more technology and we have more things that require technology. If we want a high quality of life, we need to work out a way to do it sustainably, and we need to just understand that it's more complicated than, oh well, we did a bad thing and humans are bad. And I actually upset some people a little while ago on Twitter, where I made a tweet that said humans are good, and I had all kinds of responses to it, and I realized it's probably a strange thing to say, but I've been around environmentalists for so long and kind of absorbed this idea of humans are bad and all we do is bad and everything that we put into the world is bad, and it's just not true or fair. We didn't know what we were doing to the environment when we used fossil fuels, but we did lift people out of poverty. We did make it so that we all had access, at least in this country anyway, to healthcare, to medication, to education, all of these things that give us a better, higher quality of life. And that's not to say we haven't made mistakes along the way, but certainly, these are all good things. And all right, a minority of people did know what fossil fuels were doing and they hid it, and this is bad. But we don't have to put money in their pockets anymore. I hate that I put money in their pockets, to be honest. I mean, the UK uses a lot of gas. It uses a lot of fossil fuels. A lot of our gas comes from Norway. We're just exporting the cost of energy to other countries all the time. And when we get coal, I've said to people, someone said, oh, well, a bit of coal now and again, is it that bad? And you don't have to live near one of these things. You read about the people in Poland who have to live near these coal plants, and the fact that they can't go outside, because it's so, we all know it's very damaging. The windows are just covered in soot. The kids all have severe respiratory issues. The lifespan is shorter. Who has to live in those spaces? Poor people, because they can't afford move. They can't afford not to. And so we're exporting all that cost because we wouldn't have the coal here, never. And we need to have the alternatives here. And we are a small country with not a lot of land, going spare. We need compact, energy-dense sources, and that's what nuclear represents. And at the moment, the only thing stopping that is just ideology, just a bunch of people who are scared of it. Not everybody, it's a small group of people, very scared of it, very loud about it, and almost afraid of the wrong thing. If you're going to be afraid of something, be afraid of what fossil fuels are doing to your children's lungs. Be afraid of what climate change is going to bring. It's not, climate change is a slope that we're slipping down. It's not a cliff. People talk about it as if it's a cliff and you're either on the cliff or you've been pushed off and it's too late. And when they say it's too late, I always say, well, what do you mean it's too late? If you're falling on a slope, at any point that you stop is good, right? At any point, even if, all right, we didn't keep within 1.5 warming, things got a bit worse, but great, we can still try and fix it. It's not great, but it's better than 4 degrees. That's all I'm trying to say. 4 degrees, that's a terrible, unimaginable future. And I don't think any of us want to think about it. And I don't think we need to, because I think we all know all the things that we need to do to improve the situation we're in, and where there's knowledge lacking, we all know we need to plant more trees, we all know we need to eat less meat, things like that. But where that knowledge is lacking, like with energy, that's where I'm, why I've thrown myself into this fight, where I'm trying to just, rebrand nuclear as what it really is. And it's not anything to do with any industry or any company. I've never taken a penny from any industry or company. To be honest, I'm just not, that sort of person. Like, I'm not a very corporate person, and I don't like working with people in those spaces. I'm an activist that used to shut down banks for investing in tar sands. That's my history. If it helps save the planet and it means that my children are going to have a better future and that we breathe cleaner air and that we still have enough wildlife for everyone because there's lots of space to replant trees, then I'm going to advocate for it. And that does fall on nuclear. And, I've heard all the arguments against it, and I've not heard anything yet that is remotely convincing. It's more frightening than the alternatives. It's not frightening. We're lucky. It's a gift to humanity. We're lucky that we have this option, because if we didn't, then I don't know what I'd be advocating for.
Well, that's a great overview, and you hit on a lot of interesting points. And I'm relatively early in getting familiar with the overall climate movement myself and the crisis and the best solutions. But at this stage, I've found that knowing that I don't know much, I think that the people I've heard who are pro-nuclear as maybe the first and foremost most attractive option, it's just been a very compelling perspective to me, much more so than what I find to be a lot of kind of emotional, impractical, and kind of unreasonable arguments from other parties that kind of want to go backward in a way that I don't think is really feasible. Or, and if it's not feasible, then it's like, what's the point? I think, you mentioned, like, one of the points you mentioned was the safety concern that people have around nuclear, which I think is a big hurdle to get over, given kind of the stigma. Just the name itself, nuclear, concerns a lot of people. They associate it with the bombs and everything. But that chart that you mentioned, I did have the chance to look at that on Our World in Data, and it's on your website as well, I think, or linked on it at least. And that was super, probably the most surprising piece of data that I saw, and like most interesting for that reason. So anyway, I appreciate you coming on and talking about all these things and telling your story, and helpful to hear about, how you got to where you are today. And again, kind of applaud you for, having the humility to see some new information and change your mind. I think we could use a lot more of that in the world these days in all sorts of, from science and activists to politics and everything in between. So appreciate you taking the time. Where can people go and, follow all the things you're working on, follow you on social media and everything like that?
I have a website at www.xeonlights.co.uk. I'm active on Twitter, and that's about it. I don't spend a lot of time online, actually. Thanks so much for having me. It was really good to have this discussion, and I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to have it, because I think it's so important.